majority of the speakers, you already have it. I will merely mention that the first speaker, Professor Velimirovic from Yale University, is a very distinguished authority on the Balkans, on the books, articles, etc. His topic is Serbian nationalism and its aims. Professor Velimirovic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for bringing us together, because I think that this is of tremendous importance, particularly at this critical moment for development in Bosnia and Herzegovina. My topic is Serbian nationalism and its aims. But although I hope that I will cover that particular topic adequately, I would like to add to it some additional thoughts that I think are particularly relevant at this moment, since we were challenged yesterday to think of ways out of the current deplorable situation. Most of these solutions are connected, of course, with nationalism itself. And let me say at the outset that when I use the term, I mean modern secular ideology. Those three components of what nationalism is, I think, are very important to bear in mind. We're not talking about a movement, we're not talking about a form of identity or a form of consciousness, but we're talking about an ideology which is modern and which is secular. What is characteristic of the course of Serbian nationalism, and this is due to specific historical circumstances, is that Serbian nationalism always had an assimilationist character. And it went in two phases. In the Ottoman Empire, through the Millet system, the Serbs had their autocephalous Orthodox Patriarchy, which was located in Peć, in Metohija. This was a form of preservation of their not just religious but also national tradition. And as a consequence, the church organization became a source of assimilation of other nationalities of Orthodox persuasion within the territory of the Patriarchate of Peć. And you should remember that its territory stretched from western Bulgaria deep into Hungary and all the way to the west to Domiri, which is practically on the Croatian-Slovenian border today. The form of equation of serfdom and orthodoxy was later translated into a very similar form of organization after the great migrations at the end of the 17th century, this time no longer on the territory of the Ottoman state, but in Habsburg, Hungary and Croatia. There too, the Serbian church organization became the source of assimilating other Orthodox believers, Orthodox Albanians, Orthodox Macedonians and Bulgarians, through the vehicle of the church. The next step, extremely important and extremely revolutionary in the development of Serbian nationalism, took place after the Serbian uprisings at the beginning of the 19th century. The principal figure in this development was Vuk Stefanović Karadžić, who was a literary reformer, but also, and I think above all, a national ideologist. What he did was to upset this traditional and earlier formula of equating religion, orthodoxy, with serfdom. He developed a form of a scientific explanation of what membership in the Serb national community means. And his weapon was something that was taken from the arsenal of German Romanticism, namely the notion that language constitutes nationality. In Karadžić's case, it meant that the Shakavian dialect, the most widespread among the Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims, is only and exclusively Serbian language. Through this vehicle, a whole set of moves was developed whereby all Bosnian Muslims and many Catholic Croats who were speakers of Shtaklavian could be claimed to the Serb national community. And tremendous confusion ensued as a result, because the traditionalist interpretations of what constituted Serbdom was, of course, overturned in this new interpretation, leading to a very bitter struggle between the conservative church hierarchy and people such as Clergy, who in many respects also represented certain political advantages on behalf of, for example, Habsburg monarchy, vis-a-vis the influence that Russia exercised over the Serbs through the common literary and ecclesiastical tradition. Those would be, I think, two chief characteristics of Serbian nationalism, and you can see from either separate or a co-equal application of these forms how it could and would necessarily lead to clashes with many of Serbia's neighbors, particularly if we bear in mind that the Serb national settlement was, of course, going far to the west, beyond the borders of independent Serbia as it emerged after 1830. I should like to add several other things that entered into Serbian nationalism at the end of the 19th century, precisely because Karadzic's scientific approach to what constituted Serbian nationhood had elements of integral nationalism in it. The clear boundary between romantic nationalism and integral nationalism that is more typical of nationalist developments in East Central Europe was blurred among the Serbs. And the integral phase at the end of the 19th century shows very interesting new influences coming very frequently from Russia. Here, the ideology of Danilevsky, I think, is extremely significant. Unlike the Slavophiles, who still had universalist notions, who were trying to develop a theory about the Christ-bearing Russian nation which would liberate Europe, the world, and so on, the pseudo-Orthodox ideology of Danilevsky was far more culturally specific. And its aim was to create solutions for specific cultural zones that Danilevsky saw as operative in Europe. And within the Slavic Orthodox zone, the role that the Serbs would play in essentially anti-Ottoman operations in the 19th century was key. Equivalent role was, of course, not allotted to the Catholic Slavs, who, from the point of view of Danilevsky's ideology, were simply not up to the full standards of what Slavdom means, in which Orthodoxy was politicized. I think that this notion was very strongly represented later on in the ideologies that were running concurrent with the processes that brought about the Yugoslav state in 1918. But I would like to go further and show one particular aspect of Danilevsky's notions that were expanded, not necessarily through the same ideological source, in 1930s in now newly politicized Serbian Orthodox Church. This is something that can be called ideological secularization of religion. Of course, this was not the intention of certain key theologians of the Serbian Church. Nevertheless, this was the effect of what they were doing. I would like to cite specifically two key Serbian Orthodox theologians of the 20th century, Justin Popovich and Nicolai Velimirovic, who took many notions that were present in Dostoevsky, for example, and introduced them into the thinking of the Serbian Church. Let me try to illustrate this point. Traditional theological polemic is predicated on demonstrating the doctrinal validity of this and that point. We know exactly how these polemics operate, what the proofs are, and what the aim is. The aim is basically to bring about your theological opponent to your point of view. This can be exercised within the different dominations of Christianity and also among the great religious traditions and organizations. But when you introduce culture into this particular ingredient, then the whole debate becomes entirely different. Dostoevsky was claiming, for example, that the East, Orthodox East, was the realm of grace, whereas the West, both Catholic and Protestant, was the realm of law, and that essentially these two can never meet. If that is the definition of religious differences, then of course cultural precipices become extremely deep and cannot be bridged. The theologians I cited in the case of Serbia were arguing in precisely that way, setting up insurmountable cultural cleavages between themselves and their Catholic and Muslim neighbors. This is something that is very much represented in the current stand of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which recently, within the last 2 years, has in fact canonized Velimirovic and is in the process of canonizing Popovich as well. It's very much represented on the battleground in a politicized religion that has all the elements of fundamentalism in its proper sense. There is one peculiarity that we have to bear in mind when we are discussing modern Serbian nationalism, and that has to do with the Second World War. I think that it would be a great mistake to underestimate the sufferings of the Serbs during that particular period. But we have to bear in mind, too, what were the specific political circumstances that permitted that course of action. Unlike the situation today, when Serbia is operating independently and with a very clear political and national program, the situation during the Second World War was precisely the opposite. Serbia during that period was essentially bound, chained by Nazi fascist occupation. And hence, its armed forces in the field, which committed enormous crimes, did not have a state power behind them. And I think it made for very specific ingredients that later on constituted a problem for the communists in their state building after 1945. Let me say a few things about the nationality aspects of communism in Serbia, which is, I think, extremely important for understanding somebody like Slobodan Milosevic. First of all, as in some other Balkan countries, I have Bulgaria in mind especially, Serbian social democracy had a very strict doctrinaire scientistic tradition. In an agrarian society, it was concerned exclusively with the working class, which was practically non-existent. This type of doctrinaire leftism is something that created a very specific flavor of communist movement in Serbia, and it permitted the usage of the communist movement in basically an anti-national project during the Second World War. We should not forget that from the Serbian nationalist and perhaps even purely national point of view, the end of the Second World War was, in a sense, a catastrophe. The sort of a privileged and hegemonic position that the Serbs held in interwar Yugoslavia disappeared. The domination over the army disappeared. The established position of the church disappeared. And to make things particularly offensive, the head of state was a Croat and a communist. So within this particular configuration, you can see how there had to be certain compensations for disestablishment of the Serbs after 1945. It was essentially supplemented through convergence of leftism and centralism, which of course within an innately federative society could only be advantage to all sorts of hegemonic projects. And I think that the logic of centralism would have restored fully Serbian predominance had there not been a change in Tito's policies in 1960s. This is an extremely complicated point, and I have no time to develop it, but let me simply say that this phrase from the 60s of federalizing the federation became a source of great tension in relations among the party elites in Yugoslavia. This type of Tito's internal revolution, which brought about the Constitution of 1974, very decentralist in shape, is something that also brought about a reaction, first of all in the Serb party leadership, and then in a far broader segment of intelligentsia and national elite. Again, I'm skipping very quickly over numerous points, but it ultimately brought about, by the middle of 1980s, a new ideological configuration that in many respects is represented by Slobodan Milosevic. What is confusing about him as a figure is that his ideology represents extremely complex configurations of both leftist and rightist themes. It has elements of fascism, and of course it has many elements of communism. It is nationalistic collectivism that binds this extremely potent portion together. And I think it is also basically bound together by themes of fear that were very strong in Serbian political and cultural writings in the 80s. Fear of Albanians, fear of Croats, fear of Bosnian Muslims, fear of the West, fear of international conspiracies, a whole culture of fear which could be used very effectively to create a mass movement that would ultimately destroy the Yugoslav Federation. And also a social security, a security that is offered by a nationally homogeneous state, a state that would have a single nationality, a state that would be stable precisely because it was uninational. Now, in this context, I think that something ought to be said about the program of ethnic cleansing as it developed historically in the Balkans. I think that it would be quite unfair to say that ethnic cleansing as a project is bound only and exclusively with Serbian nationalism. We know that this is not true. We can demonstrate many other examples from the neighborhood. But it is at the same time important to note that the notion of Serbian statehood very frequently converged with the notion of expulsion of extraneous elements. This was especially true during the time of revolution when the so-called Turks, meaning very frequently native Muslims, became the object of these ethnically cleansing projects from the time of seizure of Belgrade to the expulsion of the Muslims from practically all Serb cities by the middle of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, Belgrade was anything but a Serb town. At the end of the 19th century, it was fully so, and that was part of this whole program of ethnic cleansing. But this model was applied also during the interwar period, directed especially at expelling Albanians from Yugoslavia, and it was pursued after the war as well, in the Albanian case, but also perhaps most dramatically in the case of the Germans in Vojvodina and other parts of northern Yugoslavia. I think that the project of ethnic cleansing is essentially a project of changing history. It is a voluntaristic project. It is designed to create new reality. And therefore, it is extremely important in the current anti-Bosnian operations. When, for example, in Banja Luka, you destroy all the mosques, what you're really doing is saying that a certain history does not exist in that particular terrain. I think that this model of changing history, unfortunately, was accepted in other quarters. It is particularly sad to see accepted in the case of victims of Serbian expansionism during the 1990s. Have the Bridge of Mostar as a symbol of that particular acceptance in mind. The aim of Serbian nationalism, in short, is a great Serbia, which would be nationally homogeneous. And I think that this particular aim has not wavered with all of these internal polemics among different representatives of Serbian nationalism. When Karadzic and Milosevic exchanged certain pointed barbs, they in no sense violate the essential aim of Serbian nationalism, the aim of a nationally homogeneous great Serbian state. The particularly, I think, deleterious consequence of this ideology during the last several years is that it successfully pushed away alternative models of state organization. It had tremendous effects in Croatia, for example. The response to the type of nationalism that Milosevic and his allies were promulgating in the areas that he attacked was to a large extent met in Croatia. You had examples of soft ethnic cleansing, of discrimination against non-Croat minorities, and so on. I think a particularly pernicious aspect of this acceptance is the notion of humane transfers. For example, pulling out Croats out of central Bosnia, settling them on the Adriatic islands or in Istria, essentially a form of national engineering. And of course, the notion of division of Bosnia is a very important factor in this political recipe. The crimes that were committed in Herzegovina, in Stolac, in Mostar, many other areas are a direct consequence of this particular type of acceptance. But I think that the ideology of Milosevic's nationalism and its consequences in Croatia also had significant effects in the free territory of Bosnia. And however unwelcome what I'm going to say might be, I think that the real danger in Bosnia, the most dangerous thing that can happen in Bosnia, is that the suffering that has been experienced there, massacres of the Muslim Bosnians, their despair, can produce a political program that is self-satisfying, a notion that the Muslim national program can be accomplished in a small, nationally homogeneous Muslim state, or even worse, that it could be accomplished through liberating the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a purely Muslim state. I think that precisely because Bosnian Muslims are so important for the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that they, as the most responsible factor in the state, have the future of Bosnian course in their hands. But just in case that there are any doubts about how Bosnia and Herzegovina could best be reconstructed, I would like to offer a few principles that perhaps some of you will dismiss as wishful thinking, but nevertheless are the pillars on which Bosnian state alone, I think, can ground its future. First of all, I think that it has to be based on the equality of all of its citizens, I stress the word citizens, in a civil, secular, democratic state in which nobody is a victor and nobody defeated, and in which state responsibilities are shared on the basis of parity and agreement. That, I think, is particularly important. Secondly, I think that all forms of national territoriality as a principle of political organization ought to be abandoned. All the plans from Vance's cantons, Owen and Stoltenberg's union units to contact groups' percentages are really plans for the carve-up of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They are only softer versions of Karadzic's and Šušak's parastates. In that sense, all the plans of the so-called international community have been a form of appeasement to the idea of a nationally homogeneous state. Thirdly, I think that it's essential that all refugees and victims of ethnic cleansings be returned safely to their places of origin in a negotiated, planned manner that would furthermore be financially backed up. I should add here that the so-called humane transfers and population exchanges are, to my mind, extremely dubious political projects that have very frequently ended with entirely unanticipated problems. Have in mind, for example, such things as the expulsion of Germans from Sudetenland. It certainly did not help in the subsequent years when many of the newly settled Czechs opted for the Communist Party in elections. Fourthly, it is essential to punish all war criminals in a far more efficient version of the Hague process. Fifthly, I think that it is essential, if we are talking about de-ethnicized Bosnia and Herzegovina, to make certain that the neighboring states too are de-ethnicized. Croatia, for example, cannot be a state of the Croats and law in which everybody else is a minority. It has to be a civil state in which a nationality is bound with statehood and not with ethnicity. And the same can be said of Serbia, needless to say, especially given the nature of minority problems that exist in that particular country. I have Vojvodina and Kosovo in mind especially. Sixthly, what is, I think, extremely important is a critical assessment of history and of culture. It simply cannot be that one person's golden age is another person's age of torment. Something is obviously wrong in that sort of a specific reading of history. Critical history of culture is something that I think needs to be pursued as opposed to the sort of identity aggrandizement projects that simply make us feel good. If you think that any or all of these principles are unrealistic in the current political and military configuration, you are probably right. But I thought that it was extremely important to raise these things to demonstrate that there is a clear correspondence between political vision or program and military success. And I do not exclude that particular point. Quite obviously, everything that I have said in the last few minutes is dependent on military success. But I do not think that you can have military success without a good political program. And the two things have been all too frequently in discussions about Bosnia separated. The whole Yugoslav nexus, I think, can be solved only on the basis of, first of all, state independence of all the former federal units of Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is to say that I do not see any neo-Yugoslav solution as a good political framework. Secondly, on defeat, and preferably military defeat of Serbian imperialism. Thirdly, disarmament and closer ties to Europe of all the successor states of Yugoslavia, and not just to Europe, but to the other responsible neighbors, among which, of course, I would necessarily include Turkey. And above all, de-ethnicization as a global principle. I must say also reducing the influence of some of extremist groups in the different religious communities. In most of the countries of former Yugoslavia, the public role of the clergy during the last several years has become quite distasteful. Now, these ideas by themselves, simply because they are positive or good, do not necessarily assure us of success. But the failure is not in the indifference of the great powers, which will of course pay for their indifference in independent and various ways, but I think also partially in ourselves. Serbian nationalism, not the Serbian people, obviously, takes the lion's share of blame for what has happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Croatia, in fact in the whole of former Yugoslavia. But let us not close our eyes to other sources of the present troubles. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Christopher Sivic from the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. His topic, Strategy and Tactics of the Conflicting Parties in Bosnia.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, before I start talking to my theme, I'd just like to say how much I want to endorse, particularly the last point made by Ivo Vanac, which is that the solution of so many problems locally in former Yugoslavia, and in Bosnia in particular, does lie in the hands of the people there. I think an imposed solution from the outside by itself, even if it was attempted by a united international community, pursuing a sound aim, and an aim which we could all approve, including most of the people on the ground, would not have any chance at all if the conditions were not prepared, politically, mentally, by the people on the ground themselves. But that is just, by the way, I will hope to join the discussion later on about the various principles and points put forward by Ivo Vanac. But to my theme now, as far as the topic is concerned, what I'd like to offer would be just a few thoughts, reflections on the particular strategies and tactics of the conflicting parties, and assess, in a sense, the success or otherwise of what has been attempted, and then perhaps just one or two thoughts about the future in the limited time given to me. I think one really ought to start looking at the whole problem by perhaps realizing that the only clear strategy, as well as a well worked out tactical approach, was displayed by one side only in this conflict. I think it's really only the Serbian side that had a very clear strategy that was already mapped out quite a while ago. Ivo Vanac provided much of the background, so I will not go over the same ground. It was a strategy that did not come, as well as the tactics, out of Bosnia. It came out of Belgrade. It was prepared as part of the Great Serbian Project that Ivo Vanac described. And it was happening at a time when the other two communities in Bosnia, that is to say the Croats and the Bosniak Muslims, were either unprepared or divided. In other words, it caught them at a very bad time. And one of the reasons, and again, perhaps this is an uncomfortable thing to say right at the beginning, but it needs to be said because it explains a lot of what went wrong later, was that Bosnia and Herzegovina, before this war broke out, although people were not killing each other and nationalities were living together, was not an ideal state. I think it would be a great mistake to idealize the Bosnia and Herzegovina that existed before this war. As I know from my own observation, and so many people here know also, and would vouch for it, it was really a police state. It was a police state which became milder towards the end, just before the breakup of Communism. But it was the least liberal, if we can use that word conditionally, of the republics of Yugoslavia. It's interesting that in the very state that was preparing, in the republic that was preparing much of the aggression that happened later on, paradoxically there existed there existed elements of liberalism which were not present in Bosnia and Herzegovina itself. I'm mentioning this not in order immediately to try and assign blame, to criticize and so on, but to also explain why it was possible to develop certain new strategies and approaches in Serbia, which was the aggressor in this terrible war in Yugoslavia. It was possible to prepare some of these things more openly, to prepare the public opinion for it, to do various things that were necessary for the execution of this project, precisely because there existed a more relaxed atmosphere, there was a greater degree of consensus in which various debates could take place about the different approaches and different tactics. In contrast, in Bosnia itself, there was very little that was possible to do under the rule of the Titoist hierarchy, which was in power, which was very much a nomenclatura appointed on a rather mechanical basis, on the basis of representation of different national groups, which allowed very little scope for autonomous expression of various different approaches among the three national communities that existed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm deliberately saying national communities because that is how they were defined under the Yugoslav constitution. There were the three constitutive peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And while every attempt by the Muslim community to express both its religious thoughts and aspirations, as well as its aspirations within the political setup, were very much kept down by the regime, which was presided over by the Muslims, nominal Muslims, if you like. We had a very interesting situation which was similar to that which prevailed in Kosovo. Some of the worst repression carried out against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo in the post-1981 period that repression was carried out by the local Albanians who were in charge, who wanted to show that they were in control, who had their own power interests also at stake. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, as I know from my own experience traveling as a journalist there, this was the Republic of Yugoslavia where I was most closely followed by the police at every step, where every person that I interviewed was subsequently spoken to by the police. It was a republic which preserved a sort of peace among the people living within it, but it did not at the same time allow them a kind of autonomous interaction, if you like, a debate which would have made possible some sort of evolution of approaches that would have also made common living a lot easier. And I think it was in this situation that we had a very paradoxical thing, which again goes into right into the heart of the problem, of why so many people betrayed Bosnia, why they went for other projects. Ivo Banac has spoken about the great Serbian project. It's true to say that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serbs could not claim to have been trampled upon, to have been a nationality or a group that was going to be exposed to a great deal of national discrimination or what have you, as could have been done, particularly on the basis of wartime experiences in Popovich's Croatia, with regard to the Serbs in Croatia. At the same time, I know from talking myself to a lot of Serbs in Bosnia before 1990, that a lot of them felt that they were not represented by the Serbs who were sitting in the nomenclatura. They were the so-called token of dežurni Serbia. In other words, there was a lack of rapport with the leadership, which was working closely together with the Muslims and the Croats who were in that nomenclatura. So much of what happened later on, and precisely the lack of response, constructive response or preparation, particularly in the Croatian and the Muslim communities in Bosnia, is directly to be explained by the circumstances, political circumstances, which prevailed in Bosnia right up to 1990. In other words, the members or political representatives, or people speaking as political representatives, particularly of the Bosnian Croats and Muslims, were compromised by being part of the nomenclatura, and the same was true of the Serbs who were there. However, the Serbs compensated, if you like, their weakness in that sense by the existence of a well-developed center of Great Serbian strategy outside Bosnia in Belgrade. It was there in the Serbian Academy of Science and elsewhere that the intellectual case was being prepared for Greater Serbia, and of course, later on, Milosevic provided the political leadership, and let's not forget the Yugoslav army providing the muscle. So there was a certain asymmetry right at the beginning in the position there, but nevertheless it is true to say that for a part of the Serbian community, and interestingly enough, the more liberal part of the Serbian community, that again is a paradox. There was little loyalty to Bosnia and Herzegovina because it was felt essentially to be as a fairly Stalinist almost police state in which they were not given their proper position as free spirits, if you like, or free citizens, but also to a certain extent as Serbs. That partly explains, I think, some of the Serbian alienation that occurred despite the fact that we now have very hearteningly still a lot of Serbs who are fighting for Bosnia, and indeed perhaps some who are rethinking their own previous approach and are coming back to the defense of the Bosnian state as the best solution for themselves. However, this is just by way of an introductory explanation, as I see it, of what lay at the basis of some of the national attitudes. Now, we don't need perhaps to go into the great detail what actually happened on the ground, because it's quite clear that the aim of the great Serbian strategy in Bosnia and Herzegovina was, in fact, the destruction of the Muslim community. There's no other way to describe it. The destruction of the Muslim community conceived in terms of either their expulsion, partial annihilation in numbers which were dictated simply by military needs. The technology was not there to, if you like, kill all the Muslims, even if you could. I mean, there were no gas chambers around, there were no, the technology was not, forgive me this rather grim language which I use, but I think those were the chilling terms in which the approach to the problem of the Muslims from the great Serbian point of view was discussed. So the next best strategy was chosen, which was that of partial expulsion, partial destruction, physical destruction, and partial conversion back to what the Serbs regarded. And here we have the important factor, which is one of the erroneous idea that most of the Bosnian Muslims were in fact Serbs, the former Christian Serbs, who were converted to Islam, or forced to accept Islam during the period of Ottoman rule there. That was the theoretical basis for what was felt to be then simply as a justice meted out to renegades. That is really how the Serbian national ideology for centuries, and particularly in recent years, represented Bosnian Muslims. There was allied to it an element which later on proved to be disastrous from the point of view of the Serbian project in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that was partly reflected also in the Croatian view, which I will come to in a moment, of the Bosnian Muslims as essentially non-military. We yesterday heard the psychological interpretation as Muslims, the Muslims of Bosnia and Herzegovina as essentially sensual people. I believe the term used was anal, very introspective, given to pleasure, soft, given to compromise, and so on and so forth. That stereotype view very strongly influenced Serbian thinking, as it did to a certain extent of Croatian thinking, as I say, I'll come back to it in a moment. And it presupposed that the Bosnian Muslims would not fight when it came to a serious challenge to them, that they would knuckle under, and that they would just simply give way, that they would either accept Serbian domination as a fact, that they would change their names, religion, or just simply leave. So that was, I think, a fatal, if you like, a fortunate mistake that the Serbian thinking made, but that showed partially, that showed in the underestimation displayed in the earlier days. Very briefly, the Serbian project in Bosnia was based on an idea of a blitzkrieg, and I'm absolutely deliberately using the word blitzkrieg. The proponents of the great Serbian strategy, of which Radovan Karadzic and the other Serbian leaders who were working with him in Bosnia were total instruments. There was one can't say that there was a native Serbian political scene which was acting in accordance with Belgrade. It was much more a question of Belgrade actually finding clients in Bosnia and Herzegovina who were advocating this policy. And the idea was that a blitzkrieg carried out, a combined political and military blitzkrieg, would very quickly solve some of the major problems the great Serbian project faced in Bosnia and Herzegovina, notably the numerical predominance of the Muslims in the eastern part of Bosnia. How do you resolve this? You cannot simply put those people, all of them, into concentration camps. You can't kill them. You can't remove them quickly. So what you do is what we all know. You carry out a few well-publicized massacres, you frighten populations in certain areas, force them to flee, humiliate them, a particular aspect, of course, which I really went well on it, but just simply to mention that the policy of raping of women was very deliberately designed, not just simply to cause harm to the women concerned, but also to humiliate the entire Muslim community as not proving itself capable to defend its own womenfolk, which we know is very important in society, certainly in the society that I come from myself, which would be taken very seriously, and that is from Croatia. Therefore, this was the blitzkrieg, military blitzkrieg plus a psychological terror policy, plus, of course, the policy accompanied by very careful execution of terror in certain areas which needed to be very quickly liberated, as the Serb would see, from the Muslim presence. That policy did work up to a point, not least because the Serbian strategy was much encouraged by the lack of interest on the Western side in any defeat of that project, or even of control of that project. In fact, there existed, and I think we will see this probably confirmed by other speakers, but that certainly I think stands, that most Western governments, certainly those concerned in Europe, were, if not necessarily sympathizing 100% with the attempt to keep Yugoslavia together by force, at any rate they were hoping that once that attempt was made, once Yugoslavia was breaking up, let it happen quickly. In other words, a quick Serbian military victory, first of all in Croatia, and then later on in Bosnia, was something that governments were prepared to put up with, and more than perhaps prepared to put up with, because they thought this would solve a number of problems afterwards. Therefore, this blitzkrieg that Belgrade was planning was actually, in a sense, postulated also on a lack of outside response, or a hostile outside response. Time doesn't permit me now to go into great detail, but just assessing the project, one ought to say that it's been very successful. 70% of territory, or thereabouts, now perhaps less. I hear the latest statistic is about 63%, because Bosnian forces have liberated a certain amount of territory, and this liberation is in progress, thankfully. But nevertheless, a large amount of territory is in Serbian hands. The Serbian forces dominate eastern Bosnia, with the exception of a few enclaves. A large number of the Muslim population has been removed, physically removed, from areas other than just eastern Bosnia, from northwestern Bosnia and so on. A large number of people have been removed in a way which would suggest that perhaps this fact might be irreversible. Nevertheless, the blitzkrieg, like other blitzkriegs in recent history, one of Hitler, didn't entirely succeed. And I think there were several factors. One of them I have already mentioned. The Muslim community was wrongly supposed by the Serbs not to be able ever to put up any significant resistance. However, the humiliated, surprised Muslim community, not well prepared, again something I will say something about in a few moments, nevertheless fought back and is fighting back much more ferociously than anybody expected. And just as has happened before, when people are underestimated in terms of their ability to hit back, they are now surprising, particularly the Muslim community in Bosnia, is surprising its enemies by its ability to respond militarily. And I think that has been an important factor in the situation, and that underestimation has perhaps led to overconfidence on the Serbian side, which is now proving to be wrong. My own assessment, as far as the Serbian project is concerned, that it is now beginning to unravel. This is not yet time, I think this is not the right time, for over-optimism. We have seen signs of recent victories of the Bosnian government forces, perhaps producing something approaching sense of not necessarily of euphoria, but of great optimism, thinking that now liberation is at hand of the whole of Bosnia. I think it would be a mistake to go, because the other side is still capable of inflicting a lot of blows, and what is more, if it finds that it now faces total destruction, and that is why I think it's important, very important that we discuss what Ivo Banac said earlier, the nature of a political project that is offered to all the peoples and inhabitants of Bosnia, in both categories, as citizens but also as national groups. I think it's very important that if Serbs were now faced with total destruction of Bosnia, with no offer of quarter, that I think this could make military operations of a kind that one hope will result in the defeat of the great Serbian project in Bosnia. This will make it much more difficult. We will get a sort of Serbian war in reverse. Once again, then perhaps the Serbian community, instead of rallying to the defense of Bosnia, as has been happening recently in greater numbers, perhaps finding itself more embittered in the defense of Karadzic and Milosevic. And I agree with Ivo Banac that we are speaking really about aspects of the same policy. They're just different names with the same project. Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I will try to summarize now a little bit of the, quickly, exactly. As far as, from what I said earlier, I think it will be fairly clear that I think that there was very little strategy, very little preparation on the Bosnian Muslim side while former Yugoslavia existed. Why? For the main reason that the Bosnian Muslim community had been the chief beneficiary after much suffering to which it was exposed in old Yugoslavia, in the interwar period, also during the Second World War, also after the Second World War, during the particularly 2 decades after 1945, during which the Muslim community was subjected to all sorts of undignified forms of treatment, as well as the general police regime which existed in Yugoslavia, being called non-aligned, being forced in many cases to declare themselves as Serbs, all sorts of things. I have had experience of that myself, talked to a lot of people in Bosnia about this. By the 1960s, due to a change in Tito's policies, foreign policy, various other factors, I think there came about a change in the fortunes of the Bosnian Muslims. They began also to benefit from their demographic superiority, which gave them hope that sooner or later, within the Tito's federal system, the Bosnian Muslims would become a real majority, that is to say, true majority in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which would entitle them to treat Bosnia as their national state, of course, with the other nationalities who live there, but essentially as the nationality on a par with the Croats, the Serbs, the Macedonians, and the others, Slovenes, who had their own national states within Yugoslavia. I think it was this fact that Bosnian Muslims were, in a sense, defending a certain status quo, which was working in their favor, that made them so unprepared to face any other possibilities. Much of the effort within the Muslim political community was aimed at preserving some form of Yugoslavia, some form of Bosnia within a Yugoslav combination. Besides, it was very difficult in the state, in Bosnia as a republic was, to organize any kind of meaningful resistance. Who are you fighting? Who is your enemy? It was not yet absolutely clear how things would work out. And therefore, I think there were also divisions in the Bosnian Muslim community. Some people were supporting still the project of Markovic, the reformists. Some were, a large number of people were part of the nomenclatura, and as such found it very difficult to adapt to new circumstances of organizing their community on what basis too. And I think therefore that this was the reason why the Muslim community in Bosnia was so ill prepared to meet the challenge, which was the most deadly challenge that it could have faced, its own destruction. I think one of the factors also was the Western influence. I'm afraid it has to be said, let us not demonize Western. I almost feel inclined now to try and defend some of the Western policies, but in this case the advice was don't rock the boat. Don't rock the boat. There is no reason to try and do anything much. Lord Carrington and the others will deliver some form of Yugoslavia. I think that this acted on the Bosnian Muslim leadership. That partly, as I say, explains why the Muslims were so badly prepared, why the response took such a lot. And just in 2 sentences, Mr. Chairman, I would like to say this as far as the Croatian community, the smallest, but nevertheless which played a very important role in Bosnia is concerned. that too was divided. Ivo Banac has spoken, therefore I don't need to say much about this very, very harmful policy of planning to divide the division of Bosnia, which was very much President Tudjman's policy, has remained his policy commitment over a long period of time. But there was a very interesting dichotomy there. The local Croats, nevertheless, wanted to defend themselves about the great Serbian aggression. And in this particular will to defend at least their parts of Bosnia against the great Serbian aggression lay part of the success of the original operation, the cooperation also between the Muslims and the Croats in 1992. The reason why the blitzkrieg of Milosevic, Karadzic and Mladic didn't come off was partly because there was joint defense in 1992 organized by the Croats in the south and the Muslims in various parts of the country. I think it was this cooperation which on the Croat side was partly influenced by the desire to preserve their own areas and perhaps later to join to Croatia, nevertheless provided a basis for some sort of development of defense of the Muslims who were as yet unprepared in the early stages. And we know what happened later on. Once again, this policy has been discussed and will be discussed later on. The mistrust that existed already in Muslim ranks because of the Milosevic, of the Tudjman policy of treating with Milosevic, plus also the arrival of large numbers of Muslim refugees into what had been homogeneous Croat areas previously of Bosnia and Herzegovina, created intolerable conditions, conditions which were not very economically satisfactory, which emphasized previous tensions and so on and so forth. And it was when this large population was squeezed into 30% of territory that, of course, the right conditions existed for the awful conflict that broke out later on. Again, this has been referred to in various ways, and we will no doubt discuss it later on. But once again, we come down to the Western influence too. The policy of dividing Bosnia territorially, providing national cantons, first of all in Avanza and other plans, as Ivo Banac said. This was also what, of course, encouraged then the local communities, I think both the Muslim and the Croats, in the remaining part that remained to them, to start fighting for survival, for territory of their own. That, I think, it was the real basis, if we are looking in more general terms, of the terrible war that broke out in 1993, and which fortunately ended in 1994 with, we don't know what kind of prospects eventually of proper cooperation. So from the point of view, just to say, the Muslims suffered grievously as a national community within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but they have a hope now, in view of their numbers, the international support that was mobilized, at least despite the best efforts of some of the Constitutional governments to stop it. They stand a good chance of regaining, I think, a large part of the territory they've lost, but I think probably not the total victory over the whole of Bosnia, which would lead in complete defeat of the greater Serbian project. So some politics will be necessary. I think in many ways, the losers, the great losers are the relatively small Croatian community of about 17–18% before the conflict started. The war has resulted in the great loss. Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I think, therefore, that in those terms we can also say that the Croatian strategy and tactic has been a failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chairman is being given about 10 minutes to comment. So I'm going to use like 10 minutes, maybe more, comment on the paper's related subjects. First, Serbian nationalism. Basically, it was born in the 19th century. In fact, Serbian nationalism in its present form did not emerge until about 1840s, 50s. All that talk about Serbian revolution being led by nationalists against the Turks, etc., do have some other aspect. it did acquire rapidly its expansionist forms in association with the Orthodox Church, and in the Balkans, ethnicity and religion are in many ways inseparable. It is part of that unique brand of nationalism, and you can trace its origin back to the communal religious system which prevailed in the Ottoman times, which was the main source of identity. In contrast, there's never been really a Bosnian Muslim nationalism. There was a Bosnian Muslim identity which was originally religious in character, and probably the misfortunes of Bosnia do come from the fact that such a national identity was not developed. Sure, there were other groups in the Balkans that began to develop their national identity late in the 19th century, Macedonians being one of these. For a variety of reasons too long to go into, Bosnian Muslims failed to develop. When it began to be developed, mainly after the Second World War, it never really acquired a viable form. And here I would like to refer to Mr. Ziric's views. So-called Bosnian nomenclatura, which opposed its developments, of course, was in the service of Belgrade, the central regime. And in Bosnia, the central regime was in the hands not really so much of the Bosnians as of the Serbs. When I visited the area and spent some time in the late 70s, I was amazed at the level of Serbian domination of the local government in Bosnia. And finally, when the Bosnian Muslims began to claim a sort of identity for themselves, they were met with opposition both on the part of the Serbians and the Croatians, because the policy of the Bosnian Muslims of accommodation worked to their detriment and, to some extent, secured harmony with the Croatians and the Serbians, but certainly didn't help them in the long run. So here, what we have really essentially is a failure to develop a degree of identity which could have permitted the formulation of a policy suitable to some extent to the Bosnian Muslim interest, whereas the Bosnians really always sacrificed themselves to maintain this harmony, which in my estimation had no real roots. In fact, when I tried to point out to the Bosnians that they had an Ottoman heritage, they said, oh, no, we don't want to have anything to do with the Turks. We've finished that. We are ethnic Serbo-Croatian, we are Slavs, and we're going to stick to it. We're Muslims, but our ethnicity, maybe it's more important than that. They have gone to this extent and making sacrifices to accommodate the two nationalities, and I agree with you that we should call them nationalities. Well, the end of it, it's obvious. Obviously, the rapid growth of the Muslim Bosnian population had something to do in stirring the fears of the Serbians and at the same time letting the Bosnian Muslims think that this ethnic, demographic superiority would automatically ensure them also political domination, which was rather naive, say that. But it certainly frightened enormously the Serbians, who had always, Ivo mentioned it, keen eye on the demographic situation of the areas they were in contact with. I think what the Serbians called Muslim fundamentalism and blamed that that was nothing else but the beginnings of this Bosnian Muslim identity, really. That frightened them, which began to take certain shape in the late 70s, especially the 80s. And as you well know, it was the Serbian Secret Service that framed the so-called fundamentalist appeal of Begovic, put him in jail and so on and so forth, with the purpose of obstructing the development of this political sense of Bosnian Muslim identity. Today, it is there. Whether this identity would reach its natural conclusions or not, this development, I do not know. What forms it may take ultimately, again, I do not dare to venture. I would agree that less emphasis on ethnicity is essential. At the same time, I think it's unavoidable if you start to look at the problem from a purely ethnic viewpoint. It's quite difficult to distinguish linguistically, although there is today even a Bosnian language is to be specifically spoken by the Bosnian Muslims. To come to other aspects of the problem, what can be done today? Where are we today? Certainly, the Muslim Bosnian resistance and its ability to fight relatively successfully has certainly recast somehow the whole scenario. My own view is that one cannot talk of a lasting solution in the area until the Bosnian Muslims acquire a position of strength. Whether the West is disposed to help them acquire this position or not, it's again debatable. But I believe that there are other ways in which the Muslims could be helped to regain further strength. While the total reconquest of the whole territories may be possible, I believe with some additional military help, the Bosnian Muslim would be able to recapture at least 15 to 20% of the territory, and I believe they're capable. Hence, one has to think whether there is any other solution beyond the United Nations and its rather failed policies. One may think maybe of a new approach to a possible Bosnian-Croatian, if not alliance, at least some sort of military accommodation that would be both in the interest of Croatia and of Bosnia. possible to think of broadening further this alliance. Albania may be thought about, even Bulgaria, but this remains to be seen, and anything that could be done to strengthen the Muslim side will, I believe, shorten the dispute and reach a durable solution in which the Muslims would feel that their cause has received justice. To conclude, my own personal view is that we should move to another more active stage, really, go even beyond the United Nations and see whether or not some forms of organization could be achieved. In public opinion, which in places is in favor of the Bosnians being enlisted in the service of a people that has suffered so much. Now, this is more or less the end of my remarks. The floor is open to discussion. Yes, please.
I very much think we're very lucky to have these discussions before us. There is enormous amount that they take up and vomit, that's true. But I'd just like to make 2 points in reference to Iovan's paper. It is absolutely true what you say, that the realization of a national homogeneous state is something which this war is designed to achieve. And if you listen to all the leaders of all the political parties in Serbia, they say very much what Velimirovic said again the other day. We want to have a state in which there will be one nation, one parliament, and one president. Now you can imagine at some point in this project the parliament which disappears because it is a national homogeneity which becomes the most important political maintenance of that national unity. I would just say that in this regard that there is something similar between Serbian experience and German experience. And you're right, there are something very specific cultural to Serbian nationalism that partakes of its history and locality. But on the other hand, there's something very similar to what German nationalism did try to achieve with Hitler, which is unite all Germans in a single state. This confusion between state and culture, this ethnic nationalism and ethnicity being so on the exclusive basis of the state. So I think there is some parallel to be made there, and I think when you say fascism, there is something that is there in Serbia today and what happens in Germany in the dead. Now, I would, on the other hand, question something which you said. I think there is a contradiction discussing the possible solutions, outcomes of this war. On one hand, both speakers agreed that the solution must come from within the area. And you quite rightly said military project of achieving military victory very well, but it must be based also, I have kind of within it as such a political project. At the same time, both seem to agree that what Ivo said, that one should seek some sort of solution within which these states will be disarmed and then brought into some sort of European framework. Suggest that really the importance of outside element. Yugoslavia was a kind of settlement between the nations and states in the region. And this settlement, in the end, did produce territorial armies, and enormous sort of enhancement of the statehood of the Yugoslav republics, and I would say provinces. What happened was very wrong, of course, that this military balance was destroyed, and this is why this particular war was achieved. What I'm saying is that is it not necessary to achieve in the area a kind of normality? It's still a situation which exists in other parts of Europe, which you have states, they have armies, and they create in some way their own foreign policy.
I didn't, I must say, get the last point. If you are suggesting that some sort of a nation system is necessary in the area, then of course one could not contradict you. But that sort of a system is predicated on so many other aspects that I cannot really envisage it at the moment. Return to some sort of a universal solution, if that is what we are talking about, I think is ruled out for a number of reasons. I didn't have an occasion to discuss precisely what was the chief structural problem with Yugoslavia, either in its royal or its communist version. But there were major structural problems, I think mainly because that particular state was perceived differently by different nationalities. I can envision normal commercial, financial, even cultural transactions in some sort of an emerging state system in the Balkans, but I don't think that it can go beyond what you see in relations among the Western countries at the moment, if they are going to some sort of a final point along this path. So I see this as necessity in order to limit the possibility of revanchism, which is always a problem. But on the other hand, it is predicated on so many other aspects that the path is not clear.
Yes.
Could I continue looking at the future political project for the Balkans? Ivo Banic said at the end of the talk that the way ahead is independence for the constituent parts of ex-Yugoslavia. But then he also said that closer ties were necessary with Western Europe. I think there is an enormous contradiction here. I mean, if state nationalism becomes the norm in the Balkans, even if lip service is paid to civic values, Western Europe will build a cordon sanitaire, will build a wall around the Balkans, will continue to treat the Balkans and its people with undeserving contempt. Alternatively, unscrupulous groups in Western Europe will try to interfere, will try to divide and rule for their own domestic political reasons. I mean, look at Berlusconi's government and the way that they have intervened for domestic reasons in Slovenia and Croatia, raising what were thought to be long dead territorial issues. And there's no need to mention Athens' attitude towards Macedonia. I think, I mean, if nationalism becomes an organising principle in the Balkans, however benignly this is dressed up, there is very little future for Bosnia. I mean, Bosnia's identity is based on multiculturalism. And we must remember that all over the former Yugoslavia, there are many tens of thousands of people of mixed background. Look at what the fate that Lord Owen and Cyrus Vance proposed for those people in Bosnia. He wanted to create dozens of mini-states through his plan, which would have left no future at all for people of mixed background. I mean, surely we must avoid committing the mistakes of the interwar period, which led to disaster for the Balkans and disaster for Europe, with nationalism elevated as a secular religion. If the Balkans continues to be an area of chaos as a result of nationalism taking to its most extreme lengths, I think also the prognosis for Turkey is also very bleak indeed. I mean, I think it will increase the isolation of Turkey from its markets, from the political centres in Western Europe and the North Atlantic generally, that it needs to have closer relations with. And so my appeal is that common living, we must have a project based on common living. Obviously, there is no prospect of reviving the old Yugoslavia. That was a failed and an unjust project. But surely after we have seen the futile experiences of nationalism so far this century, we must have the imagination and the ingenuity to devise some alternative future, above all for the people of Bosnia.
The contradiction is imagined. I at no point argued for any type of statehood among the successor states of Yugoslavia that would be in access to the statehood that exists in Western Europe. If Denmark can be independent, I see no reason why Bosnia and Herzegovina cannot be on same terms. That is all I was saying.
Thank you, Malcolm. I follow very closely the vision that you have developed for the region in the Balkans, which ideally is a marvelous vision, but there's a missing link. The missing link is how do they realize this vision of multiculturalism and reduced ethnicity and separated from the territorial aspect. Now, there is a reality in this region. The oppressed have a different need. The oppressed have the need for security. The oppressed have the need for safeguards. And we have to cater for those needs of those people who are oppressed in this region. There is the oppressor which has a different need. The oppressor may not want territorial safeguards. It may not want safeguards at all. So that it may in future exercise its ambitions, if it ever gives up those ambitions, to be able to dominate all those people again. So we have conflicting needs in the region. The missing link is the development of a strategy to realize the objective that we have just mentioned, the vision that we have mentioned. How do we reach that vision? How do we develop necessary confidence and trust in this region? How do we shift the mentality of conflict into cooperation with the necessary relationships to be developed? So I think we need to focus on this missing link between what ought to be and what is in the region, and I haven't seen a lot of that discussion, I must admit. Thank you.
Could I answer? Sure. What I was trying to say essentially is that without a political program, you cannot have the sort of a military solution that I think we would all like to see. We have heard so much discussion about the situation in all of the countries involved before 1991, which would suggest that the area itself was not necessarily a viper's nest of conflicting antagonisms. Somebody brought it to that point. In other words, there was a very concerted action to destroy these relations, to bring about, to manufacture conflict and ultimately war. That was part of political leadership in Serbia especially. And I suspect that you cannot have a reverse trend without significant changes in political leadership and in political elite too, meaning that one has to influence in many different ways changes in the mentalities that obtain from churches to political organizations, parties, and so on. If you have no faith that that can be accomplished, then the consequences of this particular war will be, as they say, the situation on the ground currently obtains. So what I'm appealing to is not some sort of a impossible obstacle, but rather to the sort of activism that can change people's minds.
You have, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I do apologize for my brief absence. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that it's a question of where you approach it from. I agree with you, Omanis, that we need this vision very firmly in front of our eyes of a demilitarized, de-ethnicized Balkans or Southeastern Europe. But of course, how to get there? Of course, we won't get it without a defeat of the project, which lies at the root of it. And I'm not necessarily thinking of an all-out military action which would lead, let us say, just conditionally to the occupation of Serbia and the process of not denazification, but denationalization or whatever, such as we have in Germany, which in many ways is, since we were talking a little bit in terms of parallels between Hitler's Blitzkrieg and Milošević's project, and so on. It seems to me that this really is the nub of the matter. How do you re-educate people? First of all, how do you prove that their project is a failure? Because as long as Serbia remains a very strong military power, able to threaten its neighbors, it will produce not only military preparations in the neighboring states for a possible defense against Serbia, it will also produce defensive nationalisms. Therefore, people will cling to their ethnicities and to all the other defensive mechanisms that they have in order to defend themselves, to also mobilize politically. Therefore, it seems to me that really, in a sense, while it's a dialectical process, we do need a military defeat, first of all, of the great Serbian project in Bosnia. We need containment of Serbia in whatever form, if nothing else happens, which will eventually reduce it to a manageable proposition in the region. And then, of course, last but not least, we need change in Serbia, which will produce a political elite willing to recognize this, but that will not happen without the evidence of a defeat. Without the defeat of the French policy in Algeria, there would have been no de Gaulle to call for the recognition of facts. Therefore, I really do think, depends on which we emphasize first, but I think the military solution is absolutely essential because no political deals are possible before that is defeated.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, one thing I'd like to say is, I think there is a danger of leaving out Bosnia in our discussion. I'm not sure I've heard actually very much about I mean, I think that a crucial thing is that the Bosnian identity is a regional identity, not a national identity. And I think that Bosnians are more and more aware of that. They realize that in the end, people were saying to me in Sarajevo last week, you know, we read that Bosnia exists. And I don't think, actually, they're going to accept any alteration in frontiers. I don't think there's going to be any. Now, a few days ago, Oslobođenje had a nice tight heading saying, Milosevic on Blazic. And of course, what it was saying was that one of the Bosnian soldiers who had captured Mount Blazic was named Milosevic. And he was a Bosnian soldier in the Bosnian army. Now, last week, sitting in our meeting in Sarajevo, here were large numbers of soldiers in the uniform of a Bosnian army, and they were all Serbs. And they came up, one by one, addressing the assembly, saying, I'm from the 2nd Corps in Tuzla.